Before you start drafting slides, you need to take the time and think through how to design them. Today we're going to be talking about 3 specific aspects that will help you brainstorm and ultimately help shape your content. The first gate is focusing on the purpose. This is figuring out exactly why the presentation is being put together and evaluating the reasoning and motivation behind it. The second gate is aligning content to audience. This is determining who are the primary consumers and gauging the appropriate context and level of detail to include based on who they are. Finally, the third gate is matching content to culture. Every company will have a perspective on presentations that's informed by its culture. We'll talk through some high-level items to consider in this area. Let's get started with the purpose of presentations. Again, building content for purpose is evaluating the meaning and the motivation behind the presentation. There could be many different purposes for needing a presentation, but today we're going to focus on 3 broad categories. And these are slides that are meant to inform, to facilitate, and to persuade. Let's start with slides made to inform. The purpose of informative presentations is to fill a gap in knowledge and reach a consensus of understanding. Examples of this would include status reports, market analysis, and any type of comparison reports. The main question to keep asking yourself when drafting this type of content is, what is the critical information that needs to be understood? Next are slides made to facilitate. The purpose of these slides is to support working sessions. These slides will help supply content that will guide conversation and elicit feedback and input from the group in those working sessions. Examples of this would include slides used for design sessions, requirements gathering, due diligence, and any type of review sessions. The question to ask yourself while drafting this content is, what action items need to be accomplished in this meeting? What content will help drive to the completion of those activities, guide the discussions, and keep the focus on what needs to be done? Finally, we have persuasive presentations. The general purpose of these types of presentations is to reach a necessary and/or desired outcome. Examples of this would include sales proposals and project approval requests, such as budget, scope changes, or extensions. The question to ask yourself while drafting this content is, what is the best way to obtain the desired outcome? What content will build the case and provide the best reasoning for what we need to happen? Designing appropriate slides really starts with building the content for purpose. So evaluate the reasoning and motivation behind the presentation and then align the content to achieve the purpose of why it's needed. Let's move on to talking about the audience. Aligning content to audience first starts with determining who the primary audience is that's meant to consume the information. Once that's determined, then you can start figuring out how to align the content to fit their specific needs. Now, there's a ton of different ways that you can attack this and different angles that you can look at, but we're going to focus on 2 specific ones today: how much context to add on your slides and how much detail to incorporate. There are 2 pieces of information about your primary audience that will help you determine how to move these levers: the role and position of the audience in the company, and their proximity to the content in the slide. The role of the primary audience determines how much detail to include in the slide. In general, the higher up the organization the audience is, the less detail that is required. Now, as you move further down the organization to resources like individual contributors, such as developers or business analysts, the detail becomes more important, and in general, more detail is appropriate because these resources need the detail to act on. Let's move to the second question. What proximity is the audience to the material? Let's use this target to represent their proximity, the center being the closest. The further someone is to the content, the more context they'll need. As you move out of the center, you encounter resources that have little to no exposure to day-to-day operations. This is likely an indirect stakeholder or someone part of high-level oversight. In these cases, the content needs to be supplemented with more context. This is more information on the who, what, where, and why of the material. And you may need to spell out things like acronyms and terminology. Inversely, as you move back inward, you encounter people with high exposure to day-to-day operations. These are people likely part of the core team that are responsible for completing the actual work every day. This audience needs little to no context, and you can likely just dive into the details. Let's put this all together on a grid that includes the ranges of context and detail. And we'll use these two colors to indicate the role and proximity of the audience. So, generally speaking, a higher level role and farther proximity requires more context and less detail. Keeping with the higher level role, these resources that are closer in proximity do not need very much context or detail. In other words, keep your slides very, very concise. Moving to lower level resources, these are your individual contributors. If they have a farther proximity, increase the context and provide more detail that's related to the audience. If they're a low-level audience with closer proximity, reduce the contextual content and maintain the level of detail related to the audience. And that's one quick way that you can start aligning your content with the primary audience. Finally, let's talk about matching content to culture. I've had the experience to work with a few different companies in my career, and each company had a distinct style on how they put presentations together. Each of these styles was backed up by a certain perspective on presentations, and this was definitely informed by the culture of the company. The first company I worked for were very formal and traditional. We wore a full suit and tie every day, and on casual Fridays, you could potentially lose the tie. Their slides were mostly just bullet points, very straightforward and to the point, with really no frills attached. Now, this company was eventually bought by a Fortune 30 company with a culture where jeans and flip-flops were actually acceptable. The slides in this organization were more colorful. The content was usually pretty high level, and for some reason, they often included some bright, out-of-focus images in the background. When I talked to the managers, they all told me that they wanted the audience to look at the slides and understand it within 3 seconds, and then focus back on them. They relied very heavily on their talking points and really their charisma. These slides were simply just a supplementary component to what they were saying. I was then recruited to a consulting company with very intelligent people, and I was back in a suit. Now, these people were super detail-oriented, and their philosophy was that you should build your presentations so that they could stand alone without any talking points. Now, they knew that people would take the presentations and ship them around, so it was very important that people could pick up the deck, read it, consume it, and pull the information they needed from what was provided on the slides. As you can see, every company will have a perspective on presentations that's informed by its culture. Observe the stylistic principles they follow and adapt your slides accordingly. A few things to consider when matching content to culture. First, look at the depth of information. Do they remain high level and rely on talking points? Or do they require the detail for the slide to stand alone? Next, think about the overarching style. Do they consume all the real estate of the slide? Are they more graphical, or do they rely mostly on bullet points? What is the color scheme, font, and general formatting that they follow? Finally, consider the overall layout. Do they have large appendices, transition slides? Does each slide need a title, a subtitle, and a kicker? This is an important exercise to go through. Matching the layout and the style with the organization's general design will help the audience consume the information more quickly.